Howdy doody everybody, and welcome back to my journey across the United States where we're talking about everything from cryptids to ghosts to downright ridiculous folklore that's scattered across America. Today we're visiting Ohio, the Buckeye State. Now, because I was born here, we're doing something a little bit special. We're going to spend a lot more time here, and because of that, I'm making this video a three-parter covering the cryptids, ghost stories, and other folklore of Ohio individually, because otherwise this would be a 3-hour video on its own. In this video, we're starting off with the cryptids of Ohio. Now, before we get started, I just want to give you this quick reminder that it would help this tiny channel out a lot if you liked this video, subscribe to the channel, and left a comment saying hi. None of this will ever cost you a dime, and it's a quick way to tell YouTube my little channel is worth watching. With that out of the way, let's dive into Ohio's cryptids. Now, as I said to start this video series, we're going to be going through what is perhaps the longest list of cryptids that I've seen so far in this series. Ohio seems to have it all when it comes to some of what I consider to be the most likely to exist among the supposedly supernatural category of folklore. We'll start with the Loveland Frogman. This story starts near Cincinnati, Ohio, in 1955 in the vicinity of a small town outside of Cincinnati named Loveland. At around 3:30 a.m., an anonymous businessman was traveling along a road adjacent to Ohio's Little Miami River, and he was puzzled when he observed a trio of non-human creatures standing on two legs, about 4 feet in height each. One of these creatures apparently lifted its hands to produce an object that, to the businessman, looked an awful lot like a magic wand. This wand not only appeared as such because of its shape, but even more peculiarly, because it emitted blue sparks from it. As one would rightfully do in this situation, the businessman fled rapidly from the situation and drove away. Now, where exactly this sighting of a wizard frog occurred is up for debate, but the pervading speculation is that this occurred along a bridge that actually passes over the Little Miami River, where Hopewell Road rapidly becomes Bridge Street, and then Branch Hill Loveland Road. I'll admit there are a handful of bridges within a few miles of this location, so it could have really been any of them. All we really know is that one of these bridges near the Loveland community was the site where this occurred. Further digging into this tale yields some sources that say that the man who reported this supposed frogman was named Robert Honeycutt. A quick look at the 1940 census yields limited information, but it does appear that in the nearby community of Hamilton, Ohio, just about 17 miles away, there actually was a man living there named Robert Honeycutt at the time. If this is the correct individual, he was probably about 33 years old at the time of this story. Now, following Robert's encounter, he claims he lost consciousness, but when he awoke, he was driving towards a police station. Ultimately, this report led to one police chief, Fritz, to visit the place where the sighting occurred and investigate. And when police say they investigate in these folklore cases, often that means they stopped their car, they might have locked it, they looked around for 5 minutes and they got back in the car. And I can't blame them. Police resources are scarce, and frankly, I wouldn't waste a lot of time looking for a frog that stood on 2 legs. Regardless, he says he found nothing. Word of the weird encounter spread though, and members of the Loveland Ground Observer Corps, a UFO lookout organization, actually apparently found reports of residents seeing a UFO in the region that evening, for what it's worth at least. These sightings, though, were not considered uncommon in the area, and many attribute this commonality of UFO sightings in the Loveland region to the proximity of Loveland to the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. Some sources actually even claim that the FBI was involved in this original encounter and that it got escalated from the police to the FBI. If you go down this FBI rabbit hole, though, that's where you'll find some of the most ridiculous conspiracies regarding the case. Frankly, after digging this direction for a bit, I don't see any compelling proof that the FBI were actually involved. It appears that this portion of the story is more based on he said, she said than actual documented accounts of FBI involvement. Regardless, at this point, the Loveland Frogman was thrust into the mind of the general public, but it surely wasn't gone. Just 3 months later, actually about 200 miles away in Evansville, Indiana, there was an event that some present as related to the Loveland Frogman. A woman named Miss Naomi Johnson encountered something creepy underwater, and some think this thing is reminiscent of the Frogman. On August 21st, 1955, Naomi Johnson, her child, and a few of her friends went swimming in the Ohio River that branches off from the Little Miami River where the Frogman was originally sighted. She swam out into the river, about 15 feet out, they say, and suddenly she felt something. Something had wrapped a claw around her knee, according to her account, and she even said that this claw felt and looked hairy, which is distinctly non-frog-like. Johnson apparently struggled and swam hard to get away, but the creature held firm, and eventually she broke free and swam a few feet, only for it to grab her and hold her again. Luckily, her friend was nearby and in an inner tube, and somehow this inner tube slapped the water, and the sound of the plastic lining hitting the water scared whatever this furry frog-like creature was and gave her the opportunity to swim back to shore. According to Johnson and witnesses on site, when she got out of the water, her leg was covered in scratches, and there was a giant green handprint on her leg that, according to her, didn't go away for weeks. Following this, Johnson and the others that were there for this event gave a lot of interviews on the encounter and even miraculously remembered that just a few minutes prior, or hours prior perhaps, to this event, they saw a flying saucer. And they started relating this encounter to that of the nearby Hopkinsville, Kentucky, Kelly Hopkinsville encounter, where little green men apparently raided a farm just a few months prior. As for proof of the giant handprint that didn't go away for weeks, well, apparently she didn't have the forethought to take a photo or show any members of the media, as no proof of this sensational claim exists, but apparently the existence of a stain, not a handprint, a green stain, was confirmed by a responding officer. Frankly, the furry description and the description of something grabbing and holding on underwater and the green stain all sort of add up to seaweed in my eyes, as I've swum in, freshwater lakes a lot, and I've had this happen to me. Regardless, whatever the truth of her story was, some think this creature falls into existing frogman folklore. It's also heralded under its own name as the Dogtown Lizard Man in reference to the area where this occurred. There's also a lesser-known sighting that's questionably, with minimal details, part of the frogman lore. This occurred in Greenville, Ohio, in August of 1955, when 4 young individuals in a car drove by something that was apparently a glowing creature standing near a fire plug by the road. That's the entire story, though. It doesn't go any further from there. There was no police involvement, from what I can tell. Now, following Johnson's underwater encounter, noise around this supposed frogman would settle down for about 17 years. That's until another encounter occurred on March 3rd of 1972. And this is where we link up with the better-known Loveland Frogman folklore. On this day, one officer, Ray Shockey, was patrolling Riverside Drive in Loveland, just about 2.3 miles from the location of the original Frogman sighting, when on this icy evening he slammed on his brakes because he saw something and stopped just fast enough to avoid hitting a creature darting across the road. Apparently this creature, once illuminated by his headlights, appeared to be a large frog that was standing on 2 legs with strangely human eyes. Apparently for a while this hominid frog just looked at him, and then it decided to flee, jumping over the guardrail of the road and going down to the Little Miami River below. Upon this sighting, Officer Ray Shockey would beckon more officers to search for the creature with him, but the only thing they were able to find were scratch marks on the guardrail that the frog had fled over. This sighting, while brief, was not alone. 2 weeks later, Officer Mark Matthews was patrolling the region as well, and he was driving down the road and he saw an odd-looking creature that he thought was an injured animal lying beside it. He stopped the car, and he hoped to move the creature, but then he saw the creature move. It was still alive. Apparently this scared Matthews because this prompted him to start blasting at it with his blaster, if we're going to put it in Star Wars terms. Now, this act is often painted as one of stupidity, but with the officer shooting at an intelligent creature that he didn't understand. In my personal opinion, he probably thought this was an injured animal that wasn't quite deceased, so I'm inclined to believe that Officer Mark Matthews was acting in an act of mercy, if that makes sense. Regardless, the creature, despite being blasted 4 times by Matthews' account, was able to make its way to the guardrail nearby and hobble down to the Little Miami River below. Now, given all of the hubbub around this creature, Ray Shockey decided folks needed an idea of what exactly had been sighted. So he had his sister, which was apparently a good artist, illustrate the creature he saw. This illustration is now somewhat famous. If you Google the Loveland Frogman online, you'll be met with this sketch of the supposed reptilian creature. Admittedly, even with the power of Google's reverse image tool, I wasn't able to tell if this image I'm showing here is the true illustration or not, but that is what folks claim about this image, aside from the similarly common claim that the author of this sketch is unknown. So just saying it now, it's inconclusive whether the sketch I'm showing on the screen is the legitimate original sketch, but it does fall in line with others on the internet. Moving on though, these 2 officers, and Loveland, Ohio law enforcement in general, got a bit of a reputation for being crazy rather than brave following their encounter with this supposed frogman. And for at least 30 years, there really wasn't any movement on this case. As far as the general public was aware, the frogman had been blasted but miraculously survived and escaped into the water below. That's until a series of interviews with Mark Matthews occurred. Now, forgive me if I get this part wrong. The details are a bit murky and confusing, with some sources saying email interview in 2001 and others saying in-person interview in 1999, but frankly, from what I can tell, both of these interviews did happen. Regardless, I believe in 1999, Officer Matthews claimed that he had his story told to a writer that was writing about urban legends in the area, and this is what spread to the legend of the Loveland Frogman we all know today. But this writer miraculously left out the part of the story where, according to Matthews, when he pew-pewed the creature, it didn't run off, rather it passed away, and he put it in the trunk of his squad car. And then he claims he brought the creature to Ray Shockey. The 2 apparently confirmed what they saw to one another, and it wasn't some frogman, rather it was a iguana missing its tail that presumably, I guess, was a dumped pet, or an escaped pet, or something else. In one interview, he even claimed it didn't even stand or have leathery skin like he first reported. Now, in 2001, Weird Ohio, which is a website, reached out to someone that they'd previously interviewed about the case, one Ron Schaffner. He was someone originally involved in investigating the case, and Ron said, "Why, after all these years, is Matthew debunking his own story? I'm not sure. Could be a number of reasons, but both officers told us that this thing that they found resembled the sketch in 1976. Why would they show us a composite drawing of this creature back in 1975 and tell us it looked like the drawing? I lived in Loveland for about 5 years, and the story is still circulating with lots of variations. Maybe Matthews is just tired of hearing the story and all the variations." Now, going off of the quote, perhaps this is true. Matthews did, in one interview, seem to have a frustrated tone with the whole ordeal, calling the whole development just a giant hoax and claiming it was all solved, relating the Loveland frog to Bigfoot, and that he thought it was just a bunch of nonsense. On the other hand, if the misinformation annoys you now, why didn't it annoy you 30 years ago? Why not come out to the public who was very interested in the case and just flat out tell them that this was an iguana through channels like the media, rather than letting a folklore writer handle the stream of information all on his own for decades? Additionally, how do 3 different people mistake iguanas for 4-foot-tall bipedal frogs with glowing eyes and magic wands? And for many, this story is complete at this point. The Loveland frog was solved, right? Well, maybe not quite. You see, in 2016, some kids were out doing what kids did in the summer of 2016, wandering through the woods and catching virtual Pokemon in Pokemon Go. No shame there, I was among that group of people too 8 years ago. Despite this though, they caught more than they bargained for. As these kids were wandering along the shores of Lake Isabella, just about 3,800 feet from the bridge where the supposed original sighting of the frogmen took place, they saw something kind of weird. According to them, they saw a gigantic frog hanging out near the water's edge, staring at them. And then the frog stood up and walked away from them on its hind legs. By the way, it was about 4 feet tall, according to the kids. Now, they went home and told their parents after this, and their parents, to their surprise, knew the story of the Loveland Frog. The kids didn't. Now, moving on from frogs with long legs, Ohio also seems to have an issue with apes that have big feet. And they've got 3 notable variants that appear to be unique relatives to the standard Bigfoot folklore. We'll start by describing a creature that seems to hang out in a little area called the Cedar Bog Nature Preserve. A nature preserve that's just about 42 miles west of Columbus or 27 miles northeast of Dayton, Ohio. Frankly, if you look up the photos of the bog, the place is beautiful. There are boardwalks that make their way across the bog for you to explore and take in the natural beauty without getting your feet wet. Now, this place was founded in 1942 by the Ohio Historical Society, and it was actually the first nature preserve in the state. These days, it continues to be an important preserve, and it houses about a quarter of Ohio's native plant species, as well as a number of species of reptiles, fish, and birds. The thing is, though, there are whispers that something else lives in this pristine ecosystem, wading its way through the bog and keeping a low profile when guests are around. See, it was actually the year of the preserve's opening, again in 1942, that weird reports started coming in of folks seeing a large ape wandering through Cedar Bog Nature Preserve. Some reports even stated that this ape had white hair. Generally, I can only imagine there was confusion because of this. Let me be frank, 1942 was well before the time that Sasquatch was a pop culture icon like it is today. For instance, the first big news of a big-footed monster didn't even come out until 1958, when a road contractor working in Northern California made plastic casts of a large footprint set he found near his construction site. And this made national news because some of these large footprints clearly were not those of bears. Heck, it wouldn't even be until about 1967 until the Patterson-Gimlin Bigfoot film was popularized. In short, these reports of a hairy ape man came far before that sort of topic was extremely popular. All these people knew whatever this creature was too big to be a simple man, and at the time, they didn't have a clue what it was. This story isn't just story either, as some say there were some real-world consequences that came from it. At one point in 1945, for instance, an empty car belonging to a local teenager was found parked by a nature preserve. It was discovered that this teen and 2 of his friends had gone camping in the preserve, but given they couldn't find anything but a trail of footprints leading into the preserve when they went looking for the kids, a search was launched. This search yielded nothing, and the teens were never seen again. Locals took this as a sign that whatever ape-like beast folks had seen roaming the preserve had gotten these boys. In response, kind of ominously, a barbed wire fence was erected around the preserve, and it was surrounded by signs warning of the danger of entering the preserve. Now, the public statement about this was that they were erecting this fence to reduce incidents of deer running in front of automobiles, but individuals couldn't help themselves but wonder whether the authorities were actually just trying to keep something large and dangerous inside of the preserve instead. This fence and the story that came with it actually drove so-called monster hunters to arrive and looked for the aptly named Cedar Bog Monster, and even prompted groups of local, unruly, and revenge-seeking teens to come to the area to look for the monster too. This prompted plenty of sightings of the creature, which, frankly, could have been just teens and monster hunters seeing other teens and monster hunters, but otherwise, nothing else notable really happened for a while, and tensions eventually settled down, and this story became sort of like a local ghost stories that folks would tell to their kids as they drove by the preserve to give the kids a spook. That is, until some kids decided to use the nature preserve's adjacent road as their own little lover's lane. These 2 kids parked there one night in the 1940s and decided to go in for a smooch. But suddenly, the girl in the situation started hearing some rustling in a bush outside of the car, and then both of the kids lifted their heads, and then, out of their rear window, they saw what they reported to authorities was a nearly 7-foot tall creature, gazing into the window of the vehicle, and then they smelled something absolutely terrible. Needless to say, they drove away fast and learned their lesson about lovers' lanes. Nowadays, that leaves us about 80 years later, and sightings of the Cedar Bog Monster continue, raising speculation about whether this is a single creature or a whole species residing there. Folks that live nearby still report seeing strange things and hearing weird Bigfoot sounds, whatever that means, in the woods. Also, pets and livestock that live nearby often go missing or end up harmed in strange ways, which, without fail, locals attribute to the Cedar Bog Monster finding a meal for itself. They say that if you're looking to find the creature, you're best to go hunting in the spring and the fall when the mild weather draws the creature out into the night to hunt for prey. About 85 miles to the east of our prior encounter, nearing the Wayne National Forest, there's another creature too that roams through Perry County that sounds sort of like the swamp ape if you close your eyes and listen to the description. Locals refer to this creature as the Minerva Monster, but also as the Grassman. You'll figure out why the creature has these names as we progress, but I'm not going to spoil it here. In 1978, rumors started surfacing around Minerva, Ohio, that there was a large, ape-like creature roaming in the nearby forests. And these rumors started to become more real for the residents when a few children came running, crying and frightened, into the home of one Evelyn and Hal Caton, claiming that they saw a large hairy monster while they were playing in a nearby gravel pit. The parents, frankly, sound like originally they didn't even believe the kids, which, I wouldn't either, they're kids, and they followed them out to the pit to see what they saw. But lo and behold, they saw a large, hairy creature covered in long, matted dark hair with no visible neck that they thought might have been about 300 pounds and maybe even 7 feet tall. The creature apparently stood there, observing them, and was totally unfazed by their appearance. They caught the creature in the act of rooting through a pile of garbage in the gravel pit, presumably looking for food. As folks that see Bigfoot do, they took off running back home at this point. And by the way, this first report happened in the middle of the day. Now, later, on August 21st of 1978, the Caton family and some guests they had over saw something else too. They were inside of their home, from what I can tell, and they saw 2 pairs of yellow eyes in the dark, wandering around the home at about 10:30 p.m. They first thought that these were panthers, but then something stepped in front of the panthers. It wasn't another panther though, but rather the same large hairy creature from before. The accounts I'm reading, those from the same Ron Schaffner from the Loveland Frogman case, actually seem to suggest that this creature might have been being protective of the panthers, and that the panthers didn't seem to feel any fear when approached by this large creature. Apparently, the creature actually progressed towards the home and started looking around inside of the kitchen window. This prompted the Caton family to get their firearms, at which point the creature retreated. Perhaps scared of all the hubbub that it caused, or maybe because it knew what a firearm was. Regardless, like in the prior case of the Cedar Bog Monster, this creature was said to leave a disgusting smell behind that even the investigating officers that arrived on scene after the event could pick up on. Now, these responding officers searched the area and they reported to find undefined but large footprints, and then they left because I guess they didn't take the event too seriously. The next night, though, the ape returned, watching the home from the top of a hill in the distance, according to the Caton family. And then again the following night, it came to watch their house and got even closer, prompting the Catons to actually shoot into the air to drive it off. Finally, on September 8th, they saw it again, and it had a friend with it, apparently. According to one of the individuals there were 2 apes that were seen near a strip mine in the region in the middle of the day. Now, another interesting account took place on June 24th of 1980. This is with a new individual, Donna Riegler, the legal secretary for Union County, Ohio, and she was driving some country roads after a stormy evening that was apparently very hot, very humid, and full of lightning. She slowed down as she approached some railroad tracks, and suddenly her bouncing headlights, as she went over the railroad tracks, illuminated something on the road in the distance. At first, she just thought this was a dog, but when it stood there, she suddenly thought it might look a little more like a man. And that was until she noticed how tall and hairy it was. And then it apparently extended its arm or palms out towards her. And as I would have done, this prompted her to drive off as fast as possible. She apparently stopped at the first house on the way home and went inside and called the police, crying. Now, this creature has quite a few quirks that differentiate it from other Bigfoot categories. To start, according to the Ron Schaffner we talked about earlier, one of the most interesting details of the creature is that often accounts of it are accompanied by panthers being with it. This occurred during the 1970 encounters, as I stated, but also during some 80s and 90s encounters with the creature. Additionally, as I said earlier, the creature has a nickname, Grassman, and that's in reference not necessarily to the encounters with the creature, but rather because of its diet and something folks find in the woods in the Minerva area. See, in addition to folks finding lots of apparently chewed up tall grass in the fields of the region, they also occasionally find large dens in the woods around Minerva and throughout Perry County that are comprised of tall grass that is stuck together with mud. Additionally, while the original Caton family encounter with the creature noted eyes glowing in the dark from panthers that accompanied the creature, these eyes were apparently also a key feature of the Minerva monster or Grassman, and sometimes this creature is even referred to as orange eyes in reference to this feature. Funny enough though, I'm not sure if this is just happenstance or if, maybe they're the same creature. There's another Sasquatch-like beast that's also named Orange Eyes in Ohio. In the southern part of Cleveland, there's a cemetery named Riverside Cemetery, aptly because of its 3,300-foot distance from the Cuyahoga River, that apparently, at one point, was host to this Sasquatch variety named Orange Eyes. But during the construction of Cleveland, this beast and its supposed brethren apparently fled about 45 miles south to an area named Charles Mill Lake Reservoir. Now, this lake is host to a couple of cryptids, as you'll see later in this video, but back in 1959, the first sighting of orange eyes here was reported. On this night, two teens were doing the old Lover's Lane jig near the recreation area. Apparently it was a foggy night, an optimal night for lovers laning, and in the fog, these two teens heard a bit of rustling, and these two weren't causing that rustling, and so they looked out the window, and they saw large glowing eyes that were at about 7 feet in height approaching their car. This prompted the teens to run away in their car and report to authorities what they saw. Not that they were diddling around, but rather that they saw a 7-foot-tall buzzkill roaming the woods of the Charles Mill Lake Reservoir. These orange eyes, as I said, prompt speculation that this creature and the Grassman might be the same species, which, 7-foot-tall apes being 45 miles apart, I would also make that assumption. Now, let's be clear. I think Bigfoot is compelling among cryptids, but let's also be clear, when it comes down to it, I'm a dog person, and that's true for my cryptids too. I love a good puppy, and the Dogman of Defiance is just the cryptid for a guy like me because of that. Now, let's set the scene for the story. The year is 1972, it's a warm July night, and a railroad worker for the Norfolk and Western train lines named Ted Davis is going about his business. And then, as he looks down at the tracks, a couple of really hairy and really big paws slapped themselves in front of him. And then he looked up, and he saw what appeared to be a hunched-over, 6-foot-tall dog right in front of him, holding a 2x4 for some reason. Now, Ted didn't even have time to compose himself before this canine grabbed the 2x4 with both hands and smacked him with it before running away. I'm gonna be clear here, reading this story, I was like, what the heck did I just read? to the point that it almost adds credibility. If I were going to make up a story about a werewolf and tell the world about it, I certainly wouldn't be saying that this dog ran up to me with a bit of wood, like I was in a Tom and Jerry cartoon, and smacked me with it. Now regardless, despite this ruffling the feathers of Ted Davis, he was able to collect himself, and he kept this first encounter to himself and kept working, probably because he thought he was going insane and hallucinating. But on July 30th, 5 days after this original encounter, Ted was working in a similar spot with his colleague Tom Jones, and somehow or another, lucky for him, they saw the creature again. This time the creature was further away, but it was apparently watching them from the bushes, until it noticed they'd seen him, at which point it retreated. This time the two men talked and decided they'd file a police report to warn local authorities about this potentially dangerous creature or prank or whatever it was. The police found the case compelling and actually opened an investigation into the Dogman. The police chief actually made a public statement that they were taking the Dogman seriously, and they were concerned it might attack or prank locals. Now, after this public statement, more sightings occurred. Luckily, Ted seemed to get a break at this point. Many of these sightings involved the Dogman running in front of cars late at night, and they generally agreed that whatever the creature was, it looked like a dog, but appeared slightly hominid and hunched over, perhaps even bipedal. A few reports even stated that the creature was wearing jeans and a t-shirt when sighted. Eventually these sightings died off though, but only after the creature was reported on by newspapers all across Ohio. Sadly, no werewolf was actually ever seen or apprehended by authorities, but that doesn't change the fact that the Defiance, Ohio werewolf gripped Ohio with werewolf mania during the summer of '72. Now, let's speculate about what was actually going on here. To start, dogmen aren't really a rare cryptid, especially not in the region. Heck, only a short distance away to the north, in Michigan, the dogman is an extremely popular cryptid that was first witnessed in Wexford County, Michigan in 1887. In particular, it's said that the Manistee River National Forest is a place where you've got a good chance of seeing a dogman. And some even say that natives were telling stories of dogmen or men with dog heads well before the white man colonized the Americas. Additionally, globally, dogmen aren't really some rare phenomenon. I mean, just look to the Egyptians. Anubis was one of their gods, and he was a man with a dog head. Needless to say, the dogman was something that was going to be on people's minds at the time, even barring native influence. For instance, the 1941 film The Wolfman and 1935 film Werewolf of London had been in movie theaters just decades earlier. I think the point I'm trying to make here is that people had heard of werewolves at the time, they weren't some taboo or unknown cryptid, and they were part of pop culture in a sense in the 70s. Because of this, most folks in Defiance, save a few, were generally having fun with the idea of a werewolf, and news reports were saying that the local police might have been armed with silver bullets to fight the creature if they saw it, which I find to be hilarious imagery. Beyond this, most folks realistically had the opinion that this was just ultimately a dude romping around in clothing over a werewolf costume, because, I mean, come on, for your opening act to smack a railroad worker with a wooden plank, not only is that assault, it just doesn't seem very werewolf-like to me. Anyways, personally, I love this creature, and I love the hyper-local folklore that this provides, but I'd put my money on this just being some local weirdo who still laughs at how he made the whole state of Ohio go insane in the summer of 1972. Now, lucky for you, unless you know someone who can hold their breath for at least 10 to 20 minutes at a time, aquatic cryptids are a bit harder for some Joe Schmo to go out and fake, and Ohio has a handful of these too. To start, we'll discuss the surprisingly credible tale of Bessie, Lake Erie's lock-free counterpart to Ireland's Nessie. To start with the general facts, there have been surprisingly consistent accounts of Bessie, the Lake Erie monster, that have occurred within the 1700s, the 1800s, and the 1900s, leading some to speculate whether this creature, or perhaps race of creatures, is actually a remnant of times gone by. Now, some stories you'll read online claim that Bessie was isolated to a period of time in the 70s and the 90s, I'm talking the 1970s and 1990s, when Lake Erie was really polluted. But from everything I can tell, this is simply not the case, and Bessie has actually been harassing native Ohioans, more accurately since 1973, when a ship captain, who had himself and his crew out duck hunting on Lake Erie's shallower portions, reported that his ship started rocking, and soon after this, he observed some sort of sea serpent thrashing around in the water around his boat. He claimed this creature was longer than one of his 16-foot fishing rods, and from everything I could tell, that's where the story ends. It wasn't sensational. A ship captain just saw something large, long, and unexplainable to him, and a lot of stories say that perhaps this was Bessie, but perhaps it was also a sturgeon. Soon after this, though, in July of 1817, another serpent was seen by a science writer, Constantine Samuel Rafinesque, that was between 30 and 40 feet in length. He thought this creature might be kin to the sea serpents that were being reported to roam the world's oceans at the time. When he saw the creature, he was about 3 miles from shore, and he speculated that the creature he witnessed might have actually been some undiscovered variety of eel. Apparently this man had a knack for trying to name creatures that he saw or things he couldn't explain with Latin names. I guess that was just on brand at the time. And also in this year, there were 2 more sightings. During one of these, a boat crew saw a similarly described eel-like animal that they thought this time was 60 feet long, and they actually shot at this creature with their muskets to no effect. In the other account, 2 French brothers living near Toledo, Ohio, saw what they presumed to be a monster on the beach that was passing away, writhing in pain, and it was 20 to 30 feet in length. They actually thought it was a sturgeon, except they reported that it had large arms, which I presume to mean large fins. They actually got pretty scared of the creature and left the scene, but returned later, hoping to see it again. And this time they found that the beach was empty. They presumed that whatever the beast was had passed away and was carried off back into the ocean. But in its place, they found deep scuff marks on the beach where the creature had been, and some silver scales the size of silver dollars. According to them, it's worth noting that some sources report that this sighting by these French brothers actually occurred in 1887, but I can't confirm which year this actually happened in, 1817 or 1887. Regardless, the late 1800s also saw quite a few sightings of large aquatic creatures in Lake Erie. These sightings entailed more eyewitness accounts by captains of fishing vessels, with sightings near Kelly's Island, an island off the coast of Sandusky, and a sighting of a 50-foot-long sea serpent that was 4 feet in circumference, apparently, churning water in the middle of Lake Erie before briefly settling to allow onlookers to get a good look at it and its large head and sparkling eyes. In 1896, this creature actually apparently came near shore one May evening, and 4 witnesses watched the creature bask in the sun for nearly 45 minutes. One of the men actually apparently ended up throwing a rock at the creature, and it apparently lunged at the rock like a dog would chase a stick. This all leads into the curious accounts of the 1980s, which saw many modern individuals observing sea monsters that better fit the folklore of the 17 and 1800s. For instance, in 1985, a boater actually saw one of the more often reported things churning water in front of him, and this sentiment was echoed in the same year by a woman who thought she saw an upturned boat off of the beach before seeing a creature emerge from the water that was apparently grinning with its head sticking out of the water. Even the Coast Guard themselves in 1985 reported sightings of a snake-like beast off of a beach in Cleveland, with some retired Coast Guardsmen and firefighters reporting a similar long-bodied creature in Lake Erie in the 1990s, with a long head that came at least 4 feet out of the water. Now, perhaps the most popular account is that of 2 buddies who went out fishing with some schlitz from their marina in Cleveland with a 20-foot-long fishing boat. They expected a day of relaxation away from their families, along with some cool beer and sandwiches, and maybe even a fish. By their accounts, the water this day was glassy smooth because there wasn't even a breeze. They went about 15 miles out into Lake Erie. For reference, this is nearly the distance to the mid-Lake Canadian border, and they popped open some of their schlitz, which for reference is a beer, and they started drinking. By midday, the beer they brought was gone, and their cooler was instead filled with fish. They were celebrating their success with the chat of cooking the fish they'd just caught while drinking more beer, and then the water around them started to swell, as if something large were disturbing it. And if you believe these two tipsy fishermen, this may have been the case. At first, the two were blown away that a storm was starting, given how smooth the water was and how clear the sky had been. But then, instead of looking at the clear sky, they turned their eyes towards the water, where they saw what was causing the disturbance, they thought. There was a large black shape under the water, under their boat, that was even bigger than their small 20-foot boat. At first they thought that this was a gigantic alligator, and this supposed gator actually somehow got a hold of their boat and started rocking it, causing their cooler full of fish to fall out of the water. Now, one of the two fishermen had the smart idea to get the heck out of the situation, so he started the boat's engine and cranked that throttle up. According to the fisherman, the sound of the engine starting caused the creature to flee. The two men safely darted back to Cleveland after this, but sadly had to buy their dinner that night. They couldn't cook the fish because, as I said, their cooler fell into Lake Erie. Now, when they returned, they reported this incident to authorities, and this whole account of something that sort of looked like a giant alligator that was black, underwater, and shaking their boat violently got attention. I could go on with sightings, but from here, they get less detailed and more generic, and I won't bore you further. You get it. Something big is in Lake Erie. Now, regarding what this big thing is, or where it came from, there's a lot of different takes. A lot of stories speculate that Bessie, or the Lake Erie Monster, was actually created during Cleveland's industrial height, when the lakeside industry polluted the lake to a disgusting extent, to the point that there is a literal account of train sparks lighting a portion of the lake on fire. During this time, folks say that the pollution mutated wildlife, and one day it turned an everyday fish into a monster. More likely are accounts that Bessie was just a giant sturgeon. We've seen this time and time again in rivers and lakes across America, where there's a body of water with folklore about giants living inside of it, and it just so happens there's also sturgeon living there that have been measured to be tens of feet long. Why does it have to be a prehistoric creature to be sensational anyways? I would personally be plenty freaked out to see a 20-foot long sturgeon swimming beside me if I were swimming in Lake Erie. Now, despite the fact that Bessie has been quiet for a little while, I think it's worth mentioning that the folks of Cleveland certainly haven't forgotten about her. One of my favorite breweries, Great Lakes Brewing Co., out of Cleveland for instance, makes a Lake Erie Monster IPA. And there's even a minor league hockey team paying homage to Bessie, named the Lake Erie Monsters. Heck, even around the time where the two men drinking beer Bessie sighting occurred, one local marina owner was so intrigued about Bessie, or I guess maybe looking to make headlines, that he offered a $5,000 reward to anyone that could catch Bessie, so he could share the creature with some professors at the Ohio State University. This was in the 80s, I believe. Needless to say, Bessie still holds a place in the hearts of the Cleveland natives. Next, we leave the large body of water that is Lake Erie, and we're moving south to a place that we've already been in this video, Charles Mill Lake. To reiterate, Charles Mill Lake is near Mifflin, Ohio, often leading to it being referred to as Mifflin Lake. It frankly isn't that exciting of a place. It's just a quiet place for recreation for locals. Back in the day, the area was settled by Pequot natives, and around the time that the white man was displacing natives in the region, there was a lot of violence back and forth between the two races of people, leading to a few ghost stories in the region that we might talk about in our next video about the ghosts of Ohio. Regardless, in this video we're not talking about ghosts, but rather a story about a creature that defies explanation that might dwell in the Charles Mill Lake. This story starts in the 1950s when tales began to circulate of a nearly human-looking creature, though lacking arms and bearing glowing green eyes and webbed feet. The first and most storied encounter with the creature was from March 28th of that year, when three young men, Denny Patterson, Wayne Armstrong, and Michael Lane, were roaming the area near the edge of the lake late at night. During this escapade, they claimed to see a creature slowly making its way out of the water, covered in the green seaweed that litters the bed of the lake. Apparently the creature was huge, at 7 feet tall, and it slowly got up after getting out of the lake and looked at them, with glowing green eyes. It's from these boys' encounter that the armless and webbed feet description makes its way into popular culture. Now, before long, the boys found themselves running away to get authorities to come take a look at the lake and look for the creature with them. And when the police arrived, they apparently did find tracks that looked like those made from diver fins, littering the shore near the reservoir. Now, this creature is a bit lonely in its sightings, as this is pretty much the only major encounter reported of it, but that doesn't stop individuals from drawing comparisons between this creature and fellow cryptids in the region. One example is the Cedar Bog Monster, which is actually Canadian, and it was observed in 1972, but this creature was also described as humanoid and rising from the lake in the middle of the night with glowing eyes. There's also the creature Orange Eyes that we just talked about that is said to dwell around Charles Mill Lake too. Folks draw a similarity between this creature and Orange Eyes, as they point out, depending on the light source you shine at an animal, the light coming from an animal's eyes can change color. So who's to say that this account wasn't just that of Orange Eyes after he went for a swim? Folks even sometimes relate this creature to the Dover Demon of Massachusetts, as the Dover Demon's eyes were also observed to be luminous and shining in different colors. Folks in the cryptid world, however, tend to slot this creature as less of an aquatic cryptid and more of a Bigfoot relative, like Orange Eyes, that was caught maybe just going for a swim or perhaps hunting for fish late at night. That being said, the webbed feet tend to suggest that this creature spends a lot of time in water, and sort of makes me wonder if these kids might have seen something like a heron. And this leaves us with our final aquatic creature, the Hoedag of Lake St. Mary. Now, Grand Lake St. Mary is, again, not something that would really stand out. In the rural western part of Ohio, leaning towards Indiana, it's a 13,500 acre lake, and it's the largest inland lake in the state that's open year-round for recreation. It's man-made as a reservoir for the Miami and Erie Canal, which connects the Ohio River with Lake Erie. According to some, this mundane place, that's man-made though, somehow fosters an extraordinary beast called a Hoedag. So I'd actually never heard of one of these cryptids before I read this story, but apparently a Hoedag is a uniquely American cryptid, and it's essentially a bull-horned carnivorous creature with a row of spines going down its back. The creature isn't really something natural that, is born and has kids. Rather, it's created from the cremated ashes of an ox and the accumulated abuse that animals suffer due to their masters. There's even some Midwest linkages to Paul Bunyan in this Hoedag lineage somewhere, but I'm going to save that part for our chat about Wisconsin Hoedags down the road in a few videos. Regardless, apparently one of these creatures was sighted around Grand Lake St. Mary in Ohio in 1910. The creature was reported to be about 3/4 the size of an elephant, with a serpent-like body, a back hump, and feet like those of a chicken. It apparently also had 2 eyes, one on its forehead and a red one on its tail. It was apparently also covered in feathers, which it would leave behind like breadcrumbs, and when it got hungry, it would go looking for dogs that lived on nearby farms that were tied up. Although apparently it preferred pumpkin pie when it was in season. You could tell the creature was nearby because apparently it would scream like a human when it was amused and moan when it was lonely. Residents speculated that the creature just appeared in the early 1900s when the reservoir was created because it was suddenly provided a great water source. Now, to break out of this story for a second, sightings of this creature and its subsequent description are reported as real in the few accounts I've read, but the theme here really sounds a lot like a few other joke cryptids that I've covered on this channel, which is to say that nothing dire or in need of explanation was occurring to draw this creature into the forefront of public mind. Rather, I would suppose that this creature was probably created just for fun, like the Gobble Squatch. Hence the ridiculous description we get of it. Regardless, who knows? Maybe there are people out there that think this creature is real, or maybe even some people who have seen one themselves. I'm not going to judge you if you have, but personally, I think this is fun, and it sounds a lot like the snipe hunt game we used to make up when we were in Boy Scouts. Now, again, we're moving on to a cryptid, or maybe just a variety of human, that we've covered before when we were actually passing through Connecticut. Melonheads. Now, let me be quickly a nerd here. I used to consider melonheads cryptids, but now I just don't know if I consider them a cryptid because fundamentally they're just humans with disabilities and perhaps a taste for blood. I don't know, maybe there's something like a vampire, if you consider a vampire a cryptid, but regardless, they're more urban legend than cryptid in my mind, but if you're going to categorize them as something, they probably belong in this video more than the videos about ghosts and miscellaneous urban legends. So here we are. Regardless, these little critters are described as small humans with bulbous heads, think Jimmy Neutron, that emerge from their hidey holes to prey on individuals that pass through secluded regions that they call their home. Usually they dwell deep in the woods off of dirt country roads where folks are likely to be lost, or get their car stuck, or maybe have a car breakdown without any cellular service to save them in this modern day. They generally fit into the category of monsters that get you when you can't be saved by the modern state of perpetual connectedness. In Ohio, melonheads are most closely associated with Cleveland's suburb of Kirtland, which was home to an individual named Dr. Crow. Spelled like the bird's name. See, Crow had some orphans that were under his care. But like all people with PhDs or MDs in fiction, he was a bad man, and Crow actually decided to experiment on these children. These experiments led the kids under his care to develop mutations, like large heads that were devoid of hair, and they stopped growing, remaining small in their bodies as their brains aged. Some stories even claim that these children already had a condition leading to these issues, and Dr. Crow just injected them with a substance that made these conditions worse. Eventually, out of anger with the doctor that ruined their lives, the children grew to be adults and turned on their caretaker, ending his life and burning down the faux orphanage that he led. When this happened, they ran off into the woods as wild individuals in the nearby forests, away from the society that would treat them so poorly. Because of this, when individuals drive through Wisner County Road in Kirtland and in the adjacent towns, sometimes folks report seeing strange-looking kids peering from behind trees at them. This story has actually perpetuated a movie about these so-called melonheads that was released back in 2010 called The Legend of the Melonheads. Generally, folks don't really seem to take this legend too seriously, with the exception of the odd Reddit post you'll see about sightings of a melonhead or similar figures. And this folklore certainly doesn't have the following that creatures like Bigfoot have, for instance. Largely, rather than being due to real accounts, melonhead folklore is believed to stem from rather sad tales about individuals with real disabilities living in rural regions and keeping to themselves out of embarrassment about their conditions. And naturally, back in the day, anything different about you was portrayed as malicious, and therefore this led to somewhat cruel folklore that has thankfully mostly died out and become more of a fun, spooky story that you tell your kids while you drive down a dark country road. And this all leads us to Crosswick, Ohio, our final destination on this search for fascinating cryptids in the Buckeye State. Crosswick, Ohio, I've seen described as a planned development that failed just outside of Waynesville in southwestern Ohio, and frankly, judging by the 2 sentences devoted to it on Wikipedia, it seems this description is apt. Despite this, an event occurred in the city that was purportedly real, and has some scratching their chins to this day. In May of 1882, 2 boys were fishing in a small creek in Crosswick, and apparently heard some rustling in a nearby bush. They decided to check out what it was, but when they got closer, they saw that it wasn't any old squirrel or bird like they expected, but rather a relatively large monster that sort of looked like a snake. Upon seeing the boys, the snake monster charged in their direction and apparently performed the distinctly non-snake-like action of extending its arms out and grabbing one of the boys, before extending 2 legs out from its body, which it used to pull the boy into a hollowed-out sycamore tree further down the creek. Now, not that the story goes any better with their help, but thankfully some men working close enough to hear the scuffle sprang into action and actually saw the snake creature with one of the boys in its clutches, dragging the child. They bravely chased the child down and were able to scare the snake-like creature to let the boy go. And then the creature retreated into the hollowed-out tree. The boy was expected to recover, but following this incident, apparently he had convulsions and experienced, I quote, fright and terror, which is frankly completely understandable, and I think kind of hilarious that the doctor that saw the child reported this to the media. I mean, of course the child had fright and terror. He was pulled by a snake into a hollowed-out tree, but I digress. What child isn't going to be terrified after a near-death experience? Now, as folks do in monster stories, this prompted a group of 60 local men to gather homemade weapons and axes and attend to the hollowed-out tree where the monster apparently lived, and they began to chop the tree down. And sure enough, this prompted the creature to show its face. But to the surprise of the angry mob, this was no simple snake, but rather a beast that was about 40 feet long and 14 feet tall, and apparently it ran upright on two legs like a hominid away from the creature before slipping into a hole down a hill towards the creek. Apparently, as it made its retreat, it moved at the velocity of a racehorse, according to the crowd. Alright, so now into the facts. To start, it seems to me that the diagnosis from the physician and the claim of 60 witnesses is apparently true, if unverifiable to be frank, because this all dates back to one actually published newspaper article. Also, while most of the accounts describe it as a snake-like creature, most folks in the modern era recognize that snakes do not have legs and arms, so this was probably more of a lizard or salamander-like creature than a snake-like creature, which sends folks in the direction of asking, what real creature could this have been? And the answer to this question is usually that it could have been a monitor lizard. Now, let's be clear. Monitor lizards are not native to Ohio, nor have they ever been 14 feet tall, nor have they ever been 40 feet in length. However, they are known to run very quickly, they're known to run on their hind legs, and some of them get as large as 55 pounds and 10 feet in length. I get that this is sort of a stretch, as I don't even know if any monitor lizard, or any lizard really short of a Komodo dragon, could actually drag a child into a tree, but this is about as close as we get to reality here. Regardless, as far as I can tell, this is about the only report of the creature from this time period, and it doesn't appear to have been broadly sensationalized like some other creatures we saw in this video, which, in my eyes, lends a bit of credence to this story, and, maybe there was a Komodo dragon living in a tree in Ohio. Who knows? What do you think? This is the wildest story on this list for me. Well, that's a hot 17 pages of cryptids I just read and my throat hurts. Regardless, I hope you enjoyed this video about the cryptids of Ohio. Because Ohio is special to me in a few ways, we're going to be taking our time here. This video, if you couldn't tell, was cryptid-centric, but we're not done here. We've got 2 more videos on the way. The next one is going to be us making our way through the haunted places, cemeteries, and spirits of the Buckeye State. Additionally, I just want to thank each and every one of you for helping me get to 500 subscribers. Holy moly, it feels like just yesterday when I uploaded my first lousy video, but now this has become a proper hobby. And successes like this make you wonder if one day this could be a job, but hey, that's just some daydreaming. Now, if you like this video and want me to ever make a penny from ad revenue, I'd really love it if you could subscribe, leave a comment saying hi, or even just like the video. This will never cost you a dime, and it's the easiest way to tell YouTube that my little channel's alright. And without further ado, whether you just saw a big hairy man watching you from Cedar Bog Preserve, or if you looked outside and saw some orange eyes staring back at you, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.